Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Friday, October 31st, and because it's Friday, maybe we'll try a good news Friday. Is there any good news out there that we can talk about?
Well, I guess we could say there's good news for the Russian military. They are advancing. Again, all the evidence that I've seen over the last 2 weeks is that they're advancing more rapidly than they have probably ever since 2022. And much more than that. We're not just talking about gobbling up territory. There are two, major towns. One of them you could call a city, Pokrovsk, that are on the verge of capture. And more than that, of course, we're talking about encirclements. So not only will they gain control of these cities, but also they will either kill, a great number of Ukrainian soldiers or capture them. And I think that's actually ongoing right now. That they are capturing and killing the ones that are trying to escape. It's virtually impossible, but there is a one escape route remaining in Pokrovsk. It's just across open fields. It's a fairly narrow route, and so you can imagine it's nearly they maybe if you run or crawl at night you can get through, but even then your chances are not good. The odds are not good. During it's impossible for the Ukrainians to supply these people. Again, this is from the Russian perspective. This is good news. It's very bad news for the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians are in full denial mode.
Okay, yeah. So when you say it's good news for Russia, does that mean it automatically it's bad news? I think many people listening to this would say, well, that's bad news for the West, right? How would you frame it that way? How would you explain? Is
I
this
think you'd
a
have to say it's bad news for the West. It's or at least the political class of the West, which has invested so much in this war, and we can see it by the way that they're dealing with it. There is essentially just regurgitating the claims of the Ukrainian authorities. Okay, yeah, there's some difficulties in some of these cities like Pokrovsk, yeah, but there's no encirclement, and the Russians are suffering huge losses. Nothing to worry about. Move on. And it's nonsense. It's nonsense. Not just because of what we've been told by the Russians, but actually by the Ukrainians themselves. The Ukrainian mappers and bloggers and other, let's say unofficial sources in Ukraine are in agreement with the Russians on what's happening here. It's a crisis. The soldiers that know what's going on are telling people, other Ukrainians, what's going on. But we're not getting any of that in the West, with very, very few exceptions. I guess one of them is this Julian Rotke of the German journalist, who is very pro-Ukraine, but he's honest about what goes on the front line, and he has good sources. But he's, just maybe he is a real outlier here. I was just checking. I heard Alexander Mercouris say that like the British aren't reporting this honestly at all. They're not talking about President Putin's ceasefire offer, which we can get into in a moment. Not at all. And I was just checking the American press, and the same is true. There are some reports, but they're all, second or third tier media organizations. The big ones like the New York Times. This should be an important story. They're not talking about it. They're not talking about the fact that again, they're just regurgitating the Ukrainian claims, the claims of the Ukrainian authorities. I think that has to be emphasized. I just was looking at one headline from just a couple of days ago. I think it was the AP. Russia claims to have encircled, Pokrovsk, denies these claims and says the situation's under control. And that's about the extent of what you can get. And then nothing about the recent ceasefire offer, which I think we should discuss right now. It's just that President Putin, it was approximately a day ago, offered a ceasefire that would provide media access to any interested media, including Ukrainian media, to actually enter into Pokrovsk and see what's going on. And the Zelensky angrily shot that down. He didn't want to hear that. But now, this again, it seems like a major event. It's not being reported because I think clearly it undermines the Western narrative. This is bad news for them. And the fact that the Russian president is actually inviting media, including Western media, to come in and take a look. Certainly, you have to say buttresses his case, and it makes it appear that, the Russians are telling the truth. Otherwise, why would they offer this? And I think he probably knew it was going to be shot down. It was shot down, but he made his point. And it goes on. I just checked, I think, right before today's episode and saw that the noose is tightening further, even within Bofkrovsk. It's not slowing down in spite of the really, I think, monumental efforts on the part of the Ukrainians to reverse this blockade, to break through the encirclement. They're having no luck. And in fact, again, the Russians are actually just further encircling. There is that one corridor I described, I think is approximately 1.2 miles. It's narrowing. It's already, and again, that's over open fields where there are no roads. I think in the last time we discussed this, I had noticed there was one road that it was not under physical control. It was a minor road and it came very close to the Russians, so it was clearly under fire control. But that last very minor road has actually been physically cut. There are no roads. And so anybody that's going to get out is just going to, again, this is the mud season too. No vehicles are going to get out. A few soldiers will escape. I think we'll see a repeat of what we saw in, for example, in Ugledar. There was something similar at the end. The Ugledar was much smaller though, but there was a garrison. Maybe there were 300 soldiers remaining. At the end, there were no roads. They had to go across fields, and it was just, a nightmare for them. And many, the majority of the soldiers were killed. But now we're talking about many more. The Russians claim 5,500. We don't know what the number really is, but it's probably in the thousands. And all of those soldiers are going to be killed or captured.
Why is the West just adopting the strategy of an ostrich putting its head in the sand? What is this? What is the idea behind that? Just to ignore it, like we won't report on this. We have an opportunity to go in and actually do some real reporting, and a temporary ceasefire. Isn't that something we've all been talking about? So,
which could become permanent. Who knows?
Right, right. It's at least it's a start. It's a start.
Yeah, I think Putin was only talking about a few hours, but it's something, right? You're right, it's something. And something it would be a chance for, again, the Russians to demonstrate their goodwill, in addition to buttressing their claims there. Yeah, it is remarkable. And you do have to scratch your head at the short-sightedness of it all, but again, I think there's so much of the Western media has actually convinced itself, that the Ukrainians really are this shining city on the hill. Their democracy, Russia's authoritarianism, and they almost feel like they have an obligation to report what the Ukrainians are saying. It's a little bit like if they don't, and they say, hey, maybe the Russians are right, well, they'll be accused of adopting Russian talking points, of blaming the victim, that kind of thing. Of course, a real media is supposed to be naturally skeptical of all authority. That's the media I remember from my childhood and my young adulthood in the U.S. In Berkeley. That was the kind of media that was celebrated. But this is not the kind of media that we have now. It's a media of narratives. It's a media that that just devotes itself to one cause or another, in support of certain authorities. And, in this case, it's the Ukrainian authorities that are closely allied with the Western authorities. And they have laid out, this is a narrative. This is, if you report these things that the Russians are saying, you could be undermining our narrative and therefore undermining the war effort. In times of war, they always say that truth is the first casualty. We should have some distance. You can say like the Ukrainian state has some kind of excuse. They are in a war, and it is about the existence of their state. But we're not, and we should have some distance. It's actually something that a service that we can even provide to the Ukrainians. I think our failure to be skeptical and have a real free press that's pursuing the truth vis-a-vis Ukraine has been very much to the detriment of Ukraine. And I say this, because recently I've been reading about those 8 years from the coup in 2014 up to 2022 when the SMO was launched. And one thing that struck me about the accounts that I read from that time was the extent, it kind of surprised me. It opened my eyes to the fact that the Ukrainians themselves really did, outside of those that were in the East and close to the line of contact, those who were in the center and back in Kiev and the western part of the country really didn't know what was going on. They didn't know. I think many of them actually didn't know the extent to which, their forces, especially these ultranationalist forces, were just regularly killing civilians over there. And that's what, again, the United Nations found that the great proportion, and not just the United Nations, the OSCE, that monitored this very carefully over the course of those years, that the great proportion of civilian casualties were over on the eastern side, rather, Donetsk, among the so-called, separatists and separatist civilians, who are supposed to be Ukrainians. They didn't know that. And one reason the citizens of Ukraine didn't know that is that because the West did so much to simply to support the Ukrainian narrative, even that. And so they had the sense, well, we got to trust these Western units, they're the land of the free press and so on and so forth. So it must be true, that it's just like that none of these rumors, these claims that the Russians are making and the separatists are making can be true. And so it really affected them. So, our media has done a disservice, not just to us, but I think to the Ukrainian people. But it almost seems like, I think particularly in the case of Pokrovsk, the Ukrainians themselves are figuring out what's going on and must become aware, as a result of this disconnect. The fact that not just their own government but Western media is lying to them. They're getting the truth. They're getting it from their own soldiers and those who are connected to them.
Right. You say the first casualty of war is the truth, and it makes sense for Ukraine because they are in this existential battle for their state there, but it doesn't make so much sense for the other Western countries. But the fact that they are doing it just is evidence then that this is a NATO war versus Russia. That's why this is the case, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I think you can make that argument. It's just like they have made it their war. And so so we can see, it's not just that they're supplying arms and intelligence and all the other things that we know that they're supplying Ukraine in money, but they're also supplying them. They're supporting them in the information war. They have actually their media is working in coordination with Ukrainian propaganda. And again, I think that's in that they are not serving the Ukrainian people. They should be a source of truth and objectivity, and they're also not serving the West well. So our publics are misinformed and our leaders are misinformed as well. I think I find it extraordinary, but it seems because of the kind of statements we hear again and again, I think that they themselves have so many of them have fallen for this propaganda. It's not just, in this case, it's not just the media, but there's obviously a lot of cooperation that has been taking place between Western intelligence services and Ukrainian. And unfortunately, it looks like in many, many cases, our Western intelligence is relying on the Ukrainians to provide them with intelligence. I was just reading there are always honest individuals. There are always, the occasional agency that isn't corrupted. And recently, I think this is actually early during Trump's current term, one intelligence agency that was giving him honest information was actually located within the State Department. which is interesting. The State Department is often even worse in so many ways than the Pentagon. But there was this. They do have their own intelligence gathering group there, or I don't think you call it an agency, a department. And they were saying, look, yeah, the Russians aren't going to be pressured. You really don't have levers on them. I'm greatly simplifying the argument, but that's basically what they were telling the Trump administration. And that was conflicting with what they were hearing, Trump was hearing from, let's say, the CIA and other intelligence agencies. And he got annoyed at it, apparently. And then the head of the state, the leadership within the State Department was telling these people, that the big guy, the White House is not pleased with what you're telling them. And they ended up firing a bunch of these people. But they were giving them the truth, and I think, unfortunately, so this extends not just to the media, but to intelligence. We just have bad information all around because we have emotionally invested in this, and we've just, we have closed our ears to the Russian position. We have decided that if the Russians say something, it's propaganda, and we don't stop and ask, okay, let's examine that. So let's see if this is true or not. Unfortunately, that spirit is lost. I'm reminded, again, this happens in wartime, but even in wartime, you would think in a real war, you would want the very best intelligence, the most honest assessments of what's going on, right? And we're not getting that. There's a real corruption. I think it's just part of a general corruption, decline of Western institutions.
Yeah, it seems like I wonder how we got to this point where there's no independence in media. It's kind of incredible to think that they're all working in lockstep. Does somebody give them orders and say, because you think that after covering the war for so many years, you would start to realize that, hey, some of these stories that we're putting out, they don't manifest into reality or not reflecting what we see in the future. Just like here with Pokrovsk and Kupiansk, we won't talk about it. Well, it doesn't matter if you don't talk about it. It's going to fall anyways because it's happening. It's happening. You can't just, pretend to live in your fake world forever. So how does this happen?
Yeah, well, I think, part of it is it's a system. Now the journalists that we do have are people that have gone through elite universities, and part of their education is, adopting the mindset of the ruling class. I think that's a good part of it. But then there are deliberate efforts, I think, on part of our intelligence agencies in particular to control information. And so the intelligence agencies, this is true going, you can go way into the past. I think this has probably always been true as long as the CIA has existed. They cultivate relationships with certain journalists in each of the major newspapers and, other news outlets. And they find people who are loyal, who can be depended on to actually fully reflect, again, whatever the intelligence community line is, whatever information they want to get out there, they'll get it out there for them. And it becomes in the interest of these people to do that, because what makes them special is that they have this relationship and they can write the story, sources say, and other journalists don't. And so they're very keen to maintain this relationship, but to maintain that relationship, they understand that they cannot anger those sources. They cannot. They have to cooperate in this in leaking or the information that the intelligence agency wants to leak. And if they really question it, if they say actually look for independent sources and maybe critically analyze it, hey, they're not going to be happy. We're going to find somebody else, and then this person actually loses his status within the news organization as a result.
Okay, so then they just ignore what's happening in Pokrovsk and Kupiansk, then they fall. Then I imagine there'll have to be some reporting about it, but then the way that they just spin it is like they'll say it's not a big deal, I guess is probably the strategy.
Well, it's actually kind of turned into a running joke as these different places, maybe it's Avdiivka or Bakhmut or whatever, before the battle begins or at the beginning of the battle. it's always, a key. It's a strategic location. It's recognized to be strategic. It's vitally important to the Ukrainians. And then when it falls, it was like, that was never important. It's no longer strategic. It's just nothing. The Ukrainian, the Russians spent months and months and months taking this tiny bit of territory that doesn't really amount to anything, and they suffered enormous losses. And I think that's probably what we're going to hear. And they're going to, put up their maps again and say, at this rate, it's going to take them 100 years to capture all of Ukraine. What a joke. And they can't do it because 50,000 people, 50,000 Russian soldiers were killed taking this little tiny village, even though it may be a city, whatever, how they spin it. I think we'll see that. And it probably works again for so many in the West who are far from the lines. I think it looks like it's no longer working in Ukraine, or it's probably, the government line is just is losing legitimacy, just like the government itself is losing legitimacy. I think that there is an increasing skepticism. It's not I think they believe too much of what they're told, and particularly about how bad the Russians are. But we can see, again, there is this real sharp disconnect between what the Ukrainian government is saying and what the Ukrainian people are saying. And I think the Ukrainian people, by and large, are believing the unofficial sources.
Yeah, it makes sense because it really pertains to them. Obviously, their lives
Right.
are the ones that are being affected, but the most. People throughout Europe are being affected. The whole world is being affected by this. But I think you're right. The issue is that most people, we are just casual observers. You and I, we talk about this a lot, so we understand what's happening. But the rest of the people, they don't want to dive that deep. And I think as the news gets more negative, the reaction is just like, well, let's just don't look at it so much. I have so many other things in my life to worry about. And so then it's just able to go on, and they just catch the headline like, oh, yeah, Russia's advancing slowly, but it's no big deal. They just took another little city, but it's not an important city. But at some point, that won't be true, right? Will there be just a point you think that the lie will just keep going, and there'll be just one moment where it's just like, the whole thing just blows up, and it's no longer, they can't cover it anymore. And then it just a mass awakening throughout the whole world, or throughout the Western world, I would say.
Right. I think so. This is a war of attrition, and has been ever since, like the middle of 2022. It's been a war of attrition, and a war of attrition is about, destroying the enemy's forces, his ability to wage war. Wars of attrition take time. I think we're seeing that the Russians have actually been very successful. This war of attrition has actually extended beyond Ukraine to all of NATO. It's depleted NATO stockpiles. I mean, it's been, which I find just mind-boggling. Again, at the start of the war, I didn't believe that this was possible. I kind of had bought into the myth of NATO supremacy. But, the Russians have very methodically and steadily through these past 3.5 years destroyed, the ability of Ukraine, first of all, but also to a great extent, the ability of NATO to fight. And, but that's the thing, is that is something that's unseen. It can be lied about. It's just like you can massage the statistics. You can, point to the map and say not much has changed here. And then you just repeat Ukrainian claims about casualties. And so even if the Russians are actually having tremendous success, this success can be hidden. And it has been hidden from the majority of the public. But when things change, as I think they inevitably will, actually you froze on me. You've been frozen for a few seconds now, so I don't know if you're hearing me or not.
Okay, it's back now. Yeah, you froze for a minute, but I think we're good now.
Yeah, okay, you did too.
Okay.
Anyway, well, I'll assume that everything I said was recorded, Right.
Yeah, I didn't hear it all though. So
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, so anyway, I was just pointing out that it's actually very easy to lie and spin a war of attrition because there aren't any dramatic changes on the map, and you can pretend that it's a quagmire, it's a stalemate, that the other side is suffering huge losses, your side is retreated but very intelligently, and the other side is suffering huge losses, so your side is winning. You can lie about it. The reverse could be true. The reverse, I believe, is in fact true. But you can lie, and you can lie convincingly. But when when the map begins to change rapidly, then it's over. You just can't lie anymore. And as I said at the beginning of this particular podcast, now the Russians are moving faster than they ever have since 2022. That's what the most recent data is showing.
okay.
And yeah, it's not, and I think most importantly, they're moving faster and taking these important strategic cities at the same time. We haven't seen anything like that again since like very early in 2022. So this is a qualitative and a quantitative change. It's still not fast enough that I think it's going to cause some sort of awakening, any sort of acknowledgement of the reality in the West. But it will. At some point it will. And then, the narrative is going to have to undergo some kind of creative change at that point. We'll see what they do. And then it may just be hysteria, and it's all Trump's fault because, he wasn't supplying weapons the way that Biden was. And we'll see. There will be fallout from that.
So you're thinking that the watershed moment for the breakdown of the Ukraine war narrative will be when there's a very rapid advance, and you're saying maybe starting to approach that, or do you think it will be a steady thing?
Well, it's accelerating. It may, and you would expect it to accelerate further after these cities fall, because against the fighting within the cities is always slow going. You're going building to building, block to block, and where the advance is most rapid is in places like actually Zaporozhye and Dnipropetrovsk, where the Russians have actually broken out into the open, and they're taking a couple of villages every day. It's not unusual for them to advance 5, even 10 kilometers in a day. And, that's down there. But when Pokrovsk falls and these other cities fall, we're going to see more of that. Just like, after Avdiivka fell, well, initially the Ukrainians threw everything they had to slow things down, but eventually there was a bloom. I think it was after Ocheretna, and things began to move rapidly. And now, we're going to see that, what they call an operational bloom. It's just like after you get out into the open and you can go in any direction you want. I think we're going to see 5 or 6 operational blooms. And so, it's going to be, it's already is faster than we've seen, and it's going to get faster. Again, do
you think that will be the moment then? When that
it could be, but we have to be careful. It just may be, on the Russian side, they may decide after they take these cities, again, Kupiansk and Pokrovsk are the ones that are in crisis, that are encircled, and they'll fall. It could be a week, it could be a couple of weeks. Maybe if the Ukrainians throw everything they have at Pokrovsk, and they have promised to do that. General Syrskyi is supposed to be there directing. They don't want Pokrovsk to fall. They're doing whatever they can. They've already thrown a lot of their best units at it and launched lots of counterattacks. And maybe they can slow it down for a while. Again, it will be to their own detriment in the end. So Pokrovsk could fall very within a week or two even. That's not impossible. But it might take longer, again, if just like the Ukrainians just throw everything, their remaining experienced units at it. But if they do that, the thing is
over.
they have to pull them. They have to pull them off other parts of the line, and it's going to accelerate in other places.
Well,
So
then also when it does fall, then it's over, right? You're saying that that would be making it their last stand if they throw everything they got at it, their best troops,
yeah, well,
and then
yeah.
once you take it, how much is there left to continue
Right.
the fight?
Well, they're just going to be that much weaker. They're obviously already weaker relative to the Russians, compared to a year ago, 2 years ago. We've talked about the steady trend, and you can see it. And that's, that trend is going to continue. And I think that trend is only going to accelerate. Again, they do have a lot of drones. Apparently they do have a lot of artillery shells, not as many as the Russians do. But they're losing men. Their morale has to be suffering. And it's, it looks very grim for them. I'm just reluctant to say, okay, we're on the verge of a collapse, because we've thought that before, but we just may be. It's bad now, and it's going to get worse. Once they get through, it's not just these two cities, but there's also Liman. You can see an encirclement taking shape there around Liman, which is another important city there up in the very northern part of Donetsk, and then Seversk. All of these are important. Once these fall, then they'll be able to go at the last remaining, large settlements. Actually, together we can call them a city: Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. That's really going to be the last of Donetsk, and they'll be able to go at it from many different directions, and they'll have a lot of open country to pass through. So it's going to, it's just bound to accelerate. Now there may be, it may be like after the Russians take these towns, they'll choose to consolidate, to work on their logistical lines. We saw them do that last year, after some fairly rapid gains. Actually, they came right up to Pokrovsk and then stopped. And so sometimes you get these statements from the West, well, they've been battling in Pokrovsk or, attempting to take it for over a year, which is not true. They came close to it and they stopped. And the battle didn't really begin until just a couple of months ago, during at the end of the summer. But they did stop. They did continue to move, actually made very rapid gains in the south. But, we've seen that there is this tempo. The Russians themselves may choose, even though they have taken these cities, not to press the advantage immediately. They have to, they'll work on logistics, they'll rotate troops. They have to remember, electronic warfare is a big part of this, and you have to you move your electronic bell jar forward and that all these things take time. So it may be, we may not see an immediate acceleration. There may be a pause, but then it'll happen. When exactly, I don't know. Probably relatively early next year.
Yeah, so you're saying how this is a war of attrition, but we're not attriting just Ukraine, we're attriting all of NATO. So when you're saying when this war is over, will we say that NATO has also been defeated or destroyed at this sense, in some sense?
Yeah, well, they have been weakened. Again, I find it extraordinary. I just figured that immediately NATO had a proxy war right on its doorstep here. They were going to, their MIC would be humming, and because their economies in nominal terms anyway, the NATO economies are something like 25 times as great as the Russian economy. It just makes you wonder. It makes you realize that there's something wrong with these economic measurements. But that's true. I heard that claim recently, and it's more or less true in nominal terms. Yet, we're finding the opposites happening. It's the Russia's MIC that's humming and is massively outproducing NATO. So Russia has grown stronger. They're a much stronger military than they were at the beginning of this conflict, and NATO is weaker. I think it's clear. Russia is introducing new weapons. I'm just not seeing them on the NATO side.
So do you think that this could mean the end of NATO after this war, or it'll exist in some some form, but just a greatly weakened state and no longer is able to sort of carry that air of supremacy and dominance that it had before. Because before it was just clear, NATO, the greatest fighting force on the planet. And now will much of the world kind of look at it as you were just smoke and mirrors? It was a paper tiger. You were a joke. Right.
Well, I think much of the world will see that. You know that NATO will fight to maintain that image and probably, will convince itself that it is the superior force until probably far past the bitter end, and that's what we've seen. I don't see them just all of a sudden becoming humble and realistic. There's going to be, at some point that has to happen, but who knows? It could go on for a long time. It's just the elite that's in place and has firm control of information in the West, is just dedicated to this idea of NATO supremacy, as a part of larger Western supremacy. It's just part of who they are. And it seems like those people they themselves have to go before it really changes. And NATO is either, becomes something else entirely. Maybe it'll keep its name. I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen when, we reach that point, when these people are finally replaced. And, where I hope that we'll have some sober-minded realists in charge who will just say, maybe the smart thing to do is to work out some sort of larger security architecture that includes the Russians. Perhaps we could have saved ourselves a lot of grief if we had done that way back.
Or just disband NATO, right? I mean, what is it? I don't know. NATO, first of all, now we're seeing just the military weakness of it. But then there's also just sort of the moral position of NATO. When I always when I was younger, I always just thought NATO, this is the good guy force. That's the image that we're presenting. But then you just kind of look at what it's done. It's like, you bomb Libya, and Serbia, right. These tiny little countries. Yeah, you beat up, and then you feel good for picking on these tiny little countries. And then when there's an actual peer rival, you're actually incapable. You're nothing. And so I don't know. I feel like the sense of goodness behind NATO has been evaporated. Also because these NATO countries, Western blocs, they all are part of the globalist or Zionist associated in some ways. These are the countries that are in large part behind the United States that are supporting what's happening in Gaza and Palestine as well. So I just feel like the whole image of the West in many ways has been tainted, including NATO. And so this idea that it's a moral force, I think, is going to be gone. And I just don't understand how it could exist when it proved that it doesn't have the capability militarily, and it also has no moral standing.
Yeah, well, you're right. Again, we've talked about the three pillars, and all of those are crumbling. In the end, NATO is going to either cease to exist or it's going to become something very different. But I don't know when that end is going to be. I'll just put it that way.
Okay, well, let me just ask one more question, and then we'll move to something else. I saw a headline that The Economist put out something that said seizing Russia's assets are necessary for NATO unity. And there's always been this talk about, we have these $300 billion or euros or dollars a year, I forget, of Russian assets, of Russian assets. Frozen in Brussels anyways. And there's always talk about how can we use this? Maybe we take the interest off of it, use it as collateral for a loan to give to Ukraine. And now it seems like we're at the point where there's a serious money problem in Ukraine. And that I hear that it's just going to run out of money in spring of next year completely. And everybody's trying to scrounge up money. So the obvious thing that they're trying to do is just, let's just take this money. And you see this economist saying this is good for NATO unity. We have to do it. We have to steal these assets. So first of all, do you think they're actually going to do it? And if they do, what will be the repercussions from such a move?
Yeah, I think they will. They've been circling around this money. I think I used the image of a vulture last time. They really want to take it, but they know it's theft, and it could cause real problems, real liability in international courts. And serious reputational damage, a part of what makes you, you could say really the the foundation of financial haven of any kind, whether we're, or any sort of financial center, is trust and, is fairness. You have to establish that reputation over time. And then that's why other countries and institutions and wealthy individuals are willing to park, huge sums of money, billions of dollars or billions of euros in your part of the world. But then if they see, the headlines, they just stole some hundreds of billions of euros or dollars. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what the currency it's in. They're going to say, wait a second, let's see. I think I may pull back. I don't want to put all my eggs in this basket that's looking increasingly shaky here. Let's diversify. Let's find something, some other financial market. I guess originally, the options were very limited. It's just like the West really had a near monopoly on these kind of things, on stock markets and other insurance services. But because of this war and the weaponization of the Western monopoly on these areas, alternative institutions and systems are being built up. And so there will be options. I don't know exactly what they are. I don't have billions of dollars, but these people are aware of what they are. And where it used to be like, no question, this is a no-brainer. I'm putting it in London, or I'm putting it in, Brussels, or I'm putting it in Wall Street. As now it's, okay, well, these places just don't seem quite so attractive or so safe as they once did. And that there are these other institutions that are growing up, and they seem to be, they're trying hard to prove that, yeah, they can provide that security, that fairness, that the Western institutions and financial centers once provided. So there is going to be a movement. It may not happen all at once, but there's already has been a movement. We've seen it out of the dollar, for example, and that this kind of action is only going to accelerate it.
Right. When you say this reputational damage that they're going to suffer, is this the reputational damage? Is it going to be borne by Europe, Euroclear specifically, or is it going to be the whole Western financial institution? People will know that, well, this is really part of just, the Western, the U.S.
I think it's going to be the whole, because the Americans are egging them on, and the Americans are talking about seizing the smaller amounts that are on American soil. So I think it's going to extend to the entire collective West. Yeah,
I'm trying to think of like the fastest way to destroy the West. I feel like we're nailing it. We're really just everything we do is
right. It's the fact they've taken. I remember like way back in 2022, they were talking about this. Obviously, they had their eyes on this money, but we can't do that. The fact that they're making it louder. And The Economist, in a magazine like The Economist, is saying do it. That tells you that things have changed. And what has changed is that they've become desperate. It's just that they don't have any options. This is clearly not their plan A. They would have done it back in 2022. There were reasons not to do it. And now the thing is, all their plan A, B, C, D, they've all failed. You can say, I don't know what the 19th letter of the alphabet is. Because you can say we have 19 sanctions packages, and all of them have failed. And so now we're looking at this. It's just that whatever we've done has not worked. And so they're desperate, and they just don't have the extra funds. Again, the Americans are cutting off. They're not cutting off the arms, but they're cutting off the flow of funds. And Europe just doesn't have the funds. Or, they don't have funds, enough funds that they can actually just simply, transfer it to Ukraine without political consequences. They already see that they have rest of populations that are not happy what's going on. Cuts are being made to social services, and in Europe, unlike in the U.S. and they can't just print money when they decide to spend it. if they have to take it from somewhere else. So anyway, if 150 billion euros are going to go to Ukraine, that's 150 billion euros left for the Europeans, for the people, for the voters. And that's a real problem. So that's why they're desperate.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll see how it all plays out. Let's move over to the China trade war. So Xi Jinping and President Trump talked in Busan in South Korea yesterday. And after the meeting, typical Trump fashion, saying he secured the greatest deal ever for America. He's the deal maker. Can he help us cut through the bravado and tell us what actually happened?
Yeah, well, it's not entirely clear what's happened. And yeah, we just have to expect that from Trump. That's what he does after every meeting. It's always the most incredible meeting ever. The meeting in Anchorage with Putin was a 10 out of 10. This was a 12 out of 10.
Oh, man.
And, yeah, so I think we can just safely ignore what Trump says because, there must be a grain of truth to it, but we don't know exactly how much. I think it's better to look at what the Chinese are saying. And they say, yeah, there have been some at least temporary concessions made to the Americans. They have postponed implementation of the restrictions on rare earths for a year. And okay, so that's one thing. That's quite
so
important.
Now it's. I saw that as well. I just want to make sure. So is that gone completely back to normal, or is it just? Is there? I don't know if there are multiple
I think I
types
saw
of
at least one or
restrictions.
two reports where they said, it's the thing is we don't know the details. That's something. It may be that that certain restrictions will remain in place and others won't. But it seems like by and large, the restrictions have been suspended for a year. So that's the main thing, the main concession that the Chinese have made. Now the Americans have decreased their tariffs on Chinese goods by 10%. They have, and there was no talk of the 100%. Remember, that was supposed to go in effect in just a couple of days, but the Americans have stopped talking about that, which is just surprised me. It was just silly. It was never going to happen. But perhaps most importantly, that measure directed against China's shipbuilding industry. They were going to impose a tax on all Chinese-built ships. Any Chinese-built ship that docked at an American port would have to pay. And I have, a substantial amount of money. And this is something that greatly angered the Chinese. It was just clearly directed at the shipbuilding industry, which is so much more powerful than the U.S. shipbuilding industry. I think, again, like 250 to 1 is the ratio. It's
275 to 1, I think.
Oh, okay. It probably keeps on growing, So that has been rolled back. And then there was also something that was put into effect at the end of September. There was a blacklist of Chinese firms, and the Americans extended it to subsidiaries of these firms. And that was something that also greatly angered the Chinese, and that's been rolled back. So we know that. I think this is what the Chinese Commerce Department has said. So I believe it. Now, the thing is, we don't have all the details, and it just doesn't matter what Trump says. I think they've also agreed to begin purchasing soybeans. So that's another. I
saw that as well.
Yeah.
At least some,
Yeah, right. At least some. Yeah, it's not clear if it's going to be all. Maybe they'll just split it between South America and North America on that. So yeah, that's what I know of, and the exact nature of it, like how much soybeans will be bought. Will all the restrictions be lifted? I think we'll have to wait to find out.
Right. So it sounds like we kind of have a trade ceasefire for a year, more or less. But we know how ceasefires get broken. I imagine, is this kind of pause, is it a pretty fragile pause? Do you imagine that it could get broken easily, that they're...
Well, I think
who knows? With Trump, you never know.
Right, exactly. Because of Trump, I think, and the Americans, they just have shown themselves very reluctant to be bound by any kind of agreement. And, it's not just with the Russians, they're always breaking agreements that they make with the Russians, but with the Chinese as well. We may see something very similar to what happened in Anchorage. Again, did seem to be some kind of understanding that was reached in Anchorage, and there was a change in the rhetoric on a very important point, the question of a ceasefire versus a general, settlement of the conflict. That changed for 2 months, but then that was it. It lasted 2 months, this understanding. And maybe we'll see something similar here. Again, there are a lot of parallels to Anchorage. In this case, they talked, I think, for an hour and 40 minutes. In Anchorage, it was an hour and a half. Again, it just seems very, very short. So I don't know. It's just like it's another castle built on sand. And then if you just look at the past several months too, there have been truces, so-called, in the trade war, the economic war between China and the U.S. Back in May, there was one, where they did agree to roll back the tariffs 100%, and they had them way up there at 145 and 125.
200 or something. It started getting crazy.
Well, maybe in some, some categories.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. Anyway, those got rolled back, and that has stuck. But the U.S. went on and started imposing these new sanctions that really angered the Chinese. And then there was another sort of truce that was worked out in September between the Americans and the Chinese. But immediately thereafter, the Americans imposed more sanctions against China. And that's, I think, what led to China actually rolling out this rare earths plan. And that greatly alarmed the Americans and brought them to the table. And maybe this time the Americans will stick to it because they know that there is a sort of Damascene over their head, namely, the rare earths restrictions, that if they don't behave this time, they will just, that'll come crashing down or slicing down.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting if they say just 1 year and then the export restrictions are going to go back into effect, or are they expecting, because there's not enough time to...
They're not being, I think they're very, very careful in their rhetoric. They don't talk the way the Americans do. We're punishing you. We're putting you on probation if you don't behave. They don't use that kind of language, which is the kind of language the Americans use. But I think it's implied. I think you can see that that's basically what it is. You need to behave, and if you don't, if you just go back to, you start violating this truce, this ceasefire, in the way that you have in the past, well, we can just we suspended the implementation of these restrictions, but we can reintroduce them at any time. Or at the very least, at the end of the year, we can just decide, because we only promised to do it for 1 year. At the end of the year, okay, we will not extend that suspension any further, and they will go into effect. And I think the Americans probably got the message, and we'll see.
Okay. All right. Well, let's move over to the Israel-Palestine, or even more so, just more actually domestically, this backlash that is growing in the United States. I'm seeing it so much. Maybe it's more my X feed and what I've been consuming, but I can see this backlash gaining momentum against Israel within the United States. And I can see also just the desperation and the fear amongst the Zionists online now. They understand that they're coming after. It's from so many different vectors. I mean, if you talk about just what's Gaza, but a big thing is actually just the whole Charlie Kirk assassination. I watched Candace Owens again last night, and she's presenting evidence of that there's an Egyptian military plane that was there at Utah by where Charlie Kirk was. And she had people that were the military people that said that they were there for a special operation, top secret. The people that talked to her said they were afraid for their life to even just tell her this information. But that they were not told, that they say they were not told what happened, what this mission was. But after the assassination, they knew what it was, because then I guess this team left on this Egyptian plane. And the thing is, Candace has come out with so many different bombshells, and the Zionists aren't ever able to refute actually what she says. They will try, and then she brings receipts later. So I like, so far, I mean, I don't know who killed Charlie Kirk, but it's becoming more and more, evidence is building, suspicion is building towards Israel. Kash Patel shut down any investigations of a foreign actor that could be involved. Why do this? Clearly, the FBI is covering something up. They're not trying to get to the truth of this. But Candace Owens is she's just built this movement. I think she's going to get to the bottom of it. I mean, she found Brigitte Macron's wee. She's going to find who killed Charlie Kirk, right? So I mean, it's like. But this backlash, I'm sorry, I'm getting a little sidetracked, is coming, and I'm just worried about what it means, because I think this desperation that they're feeling, that they're being exposed, that things like AIPAC, being a Zionist, is becoming toxic in this country. What will happen? What can they do? Because we've talked about the Samson option before, but we were always talking about it in context of if there's a war between Iran and Israel, and then Israel is looking at an existential threat and their backs against the wall, that they would launch nukes, that they would execute the Samson option in a war. But really, I think the destruction of Israel is probably more likely going to come from what's happening here in this country, this grassroots, this turn against Zionism. But you can't really execute the Samson option in that case, right? I mean, the problem here is that you're becoming hated, that people are recognizing what it is. I mean, you can't go up to someone and say, love me and support me. If you don't, I'll blow you up. That doesn't work, right? So, but what can they do? The typical kind of threats, blackmails, what kind of backlash do you think the backlash is coming against Israel? But what tools, other than these desperate propaganda attempts that are becoming more and more apparent to us, it's actually having the opposite effect? I mean, like I said, the reason that I ended up watching Candace Owens, and the reason I ended up watching Nick Fuentes, is because they were going after them so hard on Twitter that I said, okay, let me check this out. I didn't really know who Nick Fuentes. I knew of him, but I didn't watch his stuff. Candace Owens isn't somebody that I normally watch or listen to, but because of this, sure, audience is growing because of what the Zionists are doing, how hard they're saying, just shut up. So, but I'm a bit worried about, what can Israel do? Because they're that crazy, that the fact that there is a Samson option and we know about it.
Right. Yeah, I think I wouldn't be surprised if they have some sort of equivalent to the Samson option for what you're talking about. This is something they're aware of. This, I think they understand very well that the success of the Greater Israel Project really depends on this unconditional support from the U.S. And they have worked assiduously over the decades to maintain that support, and have been very successful. And now, well, you can see on one side, they're seeing the fruits of their success. They have a president that has, given them so much, especially in his first term. But even in his second term, and he's surrounded himself with the most extreme Zionists, the people that, again, AIPAC and so on, are very, very pleased with. So they look at the Trump administration, and by and large, they're very, very pleased. But they are aware of what's happening, in the rest in American society, and. Yeah, I wonder, what do they have? Do they have some sort of Samson option for America? Something that, like, if it gets really bad, we're going to have to do this or that. Who knows what they have planned. What they've done so far, you're right, has failed. And it seems like it's bound to fail more and more spectacularly as the months and years go on. I did see, at least part of that interview with Nick Fuentes. So, I knew really very little about this guy. But what I found, I think the most interesting part of the interview is the first part, where he talks about how he came to his position vis-a-vis Israel. And he was just a freshman in college, a nobody. But he displayed some talent, and it was recognized by some of these people in the conservative movement that are very closely tied to the Zionists. And they thought, wow, he could be, work with Ben Shapiro or something, because he was actually kind of echoing Ben Shapiro in so many ways. But then he questioned, it was actually a very honest question. He had no hostility towards Israel, but he was saying, like, why are we sending them? He at that point, he really signed up for the America First program. why are we sending, if America goes first, why are we sending Israel $3.8 billion a year? He just asked that question. And he thought there was probably a good answer, because all the conservatives were behind it. So it must be, but he couldn't get an answer. And he kept on asking it. And then he was only still in his first year in college, a freshman. And Ben Shapiro actually came down on him, mentioned him by name, and said, "This man is an anti-Semite, and he needs to be basically expelled from polite society," which is just extraordinary. He says like he had 100 followers or something back then. He's like, "What?" And that's actually what woke him up and made him go down the rabbit hole. He said, "Hey, there's something wrong here. I'm a nobody." And Ben Shapiro actually went after him twice, mentioned him by name twice, and an effort, as I think Tucker Carlson put it, to strangle the baby in the cradle. He saw that this guy was an upcoming star. He could be. And so he was just going to crush him back then. And as both Tucker Carlson and Nick Fuentes, agreed, is back then, the Ben Shapiros of the world actually had a lot more power. But you could see in this case, the tactic backfired. It always worked in the past. You could just destroy somebody. You affix the anti-Semite label to that person is destroyed. His career is over. And he, assumed, I think Ben Shapiro was quite confident, but he created a monster by doing that. And now we're seeing that replayed, more and more frequently, that whole people no longer are paying attention, or so many people have ceased to fear the anti-Semite label because it's been so greatly abused by the Zionists. And yeah, they don't seem to have any new tactic. It seems to be more of the same, and they're just shouting louder. Again, I think I talked about Mamdani. Now we're going to the other end of the political spectrum from Nick Fuentes, right? But something similar is taking place there. They went after him. They keep on trying, like they don't understand it's not working anymore. They keep on calling him an anti-Semite. He's an enemy of Israel, and that was supposed to end his career. It hasn't. It's actually made his career. So something has changed. They're losing control. It's clear. Even though they have at the top, the power structure, but they're losing control at the edges, and they clearly, I don't see what they can do. Again, they have made these moves to take TikTok and to influence X Twitter and all that kind of thing. And more than that, I think there was some, was it CNN or one of these legacy media outfits that's also been taken under control?
Oh, right. It was a whole thing, like CBS, Paramount, and like it was,
yeah. Okay, right. Yeah. So
it was Barry Weiss. Yeah, and
right. Who again is a very avid. She's worked with dissidents in other areas, but when it comes to Israel, she's just a complete Zionist.
Right. I remember her saying some things that I respected in the past. I was like, oh yeah, but then it's just clear that she's an Israel firster, that her loyalties just lie with Israel over anything else.
Yeah. So I think we'll see more of that. That's there's just efforts to take it over. I think in the end that's just going to backfire, and it's going to lead to, like you say, a really severe backlash. I think if you're Jewish and you worry about the future of Jews in this world, I think you should be rooting very strongly for the Max Blumenthal's of the world who are telling it as it is. I mean, it's just like you see that, okay, the more people like that you say, the more you understand, oh, this isn't all Jews. It's just a group of them, with their very powerful allies among Gentiles too. But unfortunately, like the things that they're doing, these are in the end not to the benefit of Jews around the world, but it's going to be very much the reverse. They are working hard to identify, because they're aligning themselves with this government in Israel that claims to be the representative of Jews, and that justifies everything they do in terms of their own Jewishness. And this is a recipe for disaster. And that's the way they're going. And let's just hope that they fail and that, again, the Max Blumenthal's of the world succeed, with their many, many allies on both the left and the right. Everybody from Zoran Mandani to Nick Fuentes. That's the whole spectrum, really.
Right. There's nobody that's really outside those two extremes, right. I feel like. Yeah, no, it was a very interesting interview that Tucker Carlson did with Nick Fuentes. But yeah, it just showed how they operate, that the Zionists, that they find these talents that will have political potential, and then they capture them and they bring them in. I mean, Candace Owens was the same thing, right? They did that she was part of Daily Wire, and then was in Turning Point USA, very good friends with Charlie Kirk. But then there's a falling out. But that's. I think it was dangerous for the Zionists to take that approach because, they let them into their house. They understand how things work. They are aware, and now they have this huge audience and this backlash. So
yeah. Well, in the past, it always worked. So something has changed. I think again, it's just that the dam has broken.
It's social media. It's free speech. That's the real thing.
Well, I think there are two things. It's like, okay, one reason that they weren't able, like Ben Shapiro was not able to destroy Nick Fuentes, is that there was the internet. And so Nick Fuentes, okay, he was part of some major media organizations, but they kicked him out because of pressure from the Zionists, basically. He just kept on calling up until finally he was expelled. But he could go, he just created his own channel. Now, maybe that's shut down, but he's found out. I'm not sure exactly I don't follow him, but I don't know what his situation is. But he's obviously found a platform. And you just couldn't do that in the past. That's a big part of it.
It was Rumble. But I mean, Rumble was like nothing, but he's got huge off of it. And now he's all over X. I mean, and the fact that Tucker platformed him as well, it just shows that he's becoming mainstream. Right. And then the Zionist response to this has just been so hysterical. Josh Hammer, this crazy, Israeli firster, wrote this op-ed piece. I forget where, in the Guardian or something, but just saying that, how Tucker Carlson needs to be neutralized and how we, just using that language, says he needs to be neutralized, and everybody's, it just everywhere. All these Zionists are saying how horrible it is. I mean, that's why I watched the interview, is because of this, this response.
Right. They don't understand that the old methods no longer work. They just they have a gun that they used to fire and always would kill, whoever the target was. But now
it's backfire.
They fire it and it makes a bang, but that's all.
Right. I mean, it's just falling apart on so many things. Like I said, there's just so many rabbit holes to go down when you go here. Like whether it's Charlie Kirk, just the response from the Zionists, if it's Epstein, or if it's Gaza, or Nick Fuentes, AIPAC. There's just so much that it just it's coming. I mean, one other thing I just want to throw in that I saw about Charlie Kirk is, he actually had a Catholic burial, but they kept it secret. This was just released earlier. He started going to mass. I guess he's talking to Candace Owens, was looking, he was leaving the evangelical church. He was not becoming a Christian Zionist. Just more and more evidence showing that he was moving. He was a Christian Zionist his whole life, but he died not a Christian Zionist. I guess he wasn't technically Catholic, but he had a Catholic service and burial. That was clearly something that he wanted. But there was such an effort to keep him contained as a Zionist still, from this, Charlie Kirk was the greatest friend to Israel. Christian Zionism is the greatest thing ever. That thing's blowing up.
Right. Well, I think, one thing that we can see is, I can see, again, I don't know about all of Nick Fuentes' views and whatever, because I've just heard about him. But from this one interview with Tucker Carlson, I can see that he's a highly intelligent person. That's obvious. And very independent minded. That's clear too. And I guess I'm sure it was true of Charlie Kirk and Candace Owens and these other people. Again, I haven't followed them closely, but this actually presents a problem, I think, to the Zionists. It's just that, they thought it was great. Hey, this is real talent. These guys are smart and articulate. Let's sign them up to our side. Now that's dangerous. You probably don't want to get the smart guys, because the smart guy and the independent ones, that because they'll stop and say, wait a second, and they'll start asking those questions that they're not supposed to ask. And then you can lose control of them, and you've helped to build them up, and then you got a monster on your hands, right? So it's going to force them to go to, frankly, stupid people, who are safe bets, but are just not going to do very much for them. I think that's what we're going to see. I think maybe that's true of that replacement that was selected for Charlie Kirk.
Oh, yeah, that was kind of weird. He just kind of disappeared. It was just a weird,
I guess
he showed up and it just... Yeah, well, we'll see where it goes, but it does feel like the jig is up. And then when the jig is up, I'm just wondering what else can they do and what will they do? And the reason I brought it up is because I actually saw a clip that was kind of chilling, and it's amazing how open they were about it. So this was his name, what do I have it here? He's the former Mossad director. His name is Yossi Cohen. So former director of Mossad. Mm-hmm. He did this interview in London, and let me play it for you real quick.
Did you see any surprises in Gaza?
Surprises?
Yeah.
You mean intelligence surprises?
Pages, walkie-talkies. Do you know how many treated equipment do we have in these countries?
Mm.
You don't. I do.
You mean booby-trapped equipment?
Not only booby-trapped.
And spying.
Manipulated equipment. I mean, you can't imagine the quantity. When I have invented that method, that was in 2002 to 2004.
The pager method.
The manipulated equipment method. Okay? We have already used it. Manipulated equipment in Second Lebanon War. Some of the elements were speaking to us.
How did you use it?
Want a glass of water?
We can get some brandy.
He can tell you, but he doesn't.
I know, it's an early morning in London.
Yeah, there's actually some more to it as well, where he said that we have it in every country, basically all countries, everywhere, that we have this manipulated equipment. And it's just amazing to me that they'd be open about this, that he would just say that, what we did in Lebanon with these pagers, like can't even imagine every country, everywhere. We were there. Could be booby trapped, your phone, your microwave, whatever it is. We're listening. We got so insidious, insidious. Is that the right word?
Right. Yeah, insidious.
It's wrong. Yeah, insidious. Yeah. So it's just it just blows my mind that you would even be open saying that, and it is scary. What is that? If anything, what is that? Is that a veiled threat to the world?
Yeah. Well, I think it's this growing sense of impunity, which they really should try to rein in. But we've seen it on part of the Israelis. They used to be very, very careful about the kind of face that they presented to the world. And that seems to be gone. It's just like the mask is off and they don't care. They have this total sense of impunity. And this should be ringing alarm bells all around the world. And if it leads to people being paranoid, they have a reason for being paranoid. Instead they hear about, the Russians are doing this and that. Now, all that is total nonsense. The anti-Russian paranoia is just is completely artificial. But I think we have a real justification for being paranoid about the Israelis. How couldn't you be after, interviews like that? So just to go back and maybe kind of tie this up, the Charlie Kirk assassination, I don't know who did it. I'll just say, actually, Nick Fuentes thinks that it just might be this Tyler Robinson, just a nihilistic individual. And that's possible. I know there are problems with the story, but we don't need to, the official version. But that's possible. Maybe the Israelis had nothing to do with it. Maybe this plane from Egypt had nothing to do with it. I don't know. I really just don't know. But the fact that people are looking at all these possibilities and are wondering that the Israelis are doing it, well, I think that's justified. There's this paranoia is justified because of past Israeli actions and because of statements like that coming from the former intelligence chiefs there in Israel. Right.
If Candace Owens gets to the bottom of this, and I think she will, and if what a lot of people are thinking turns out to be true, that Israel was behind this, what do you think it will be? What will happen to this country?
Yeah, well, again, official America will do whatever they can to bury the story, to denigrate it. They'll go after Candace Owens in terrible ways. I think there's no question about that. But it's out there, right? We can't hide, just like we're saying, they can't really control the narrative the way, and it's, I don't know what it's going to lead to, but it's going to greatly intensify the trends that we're already seeing. The general skepticism and now even hostility towards Israel.
I still can't just get over how crazy this world is getting, Dad. Like, it's just so many, just insane stories happening all at once, and it's just unbelievable. I mean, with Israel, the Zionists, Russia, Ukraine, with China, the trade war, and just Trump being Trump. It's just, Epstein. Oh my goodness! I feel like next year it's going to blow up. Yeah.
I just was saying, you said the trade war. I think you said the sword of Damascene. I should have said the sword of Damocles.
Damocles, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So
I heard it, but I didn't want to stop your flow.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Anyway, I misspoke there, but that's very minor.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I guess we can end it there, Dad. Is there anything else you want to say? Any?
No. I think we've covered quite a bit of ground today.
Okay. Great. Okay. All right. Have a good rest of your day and a great weekend.
Okay, you too.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.